The morning Wilhelmina Redmond showed up at the Stone Creek spread with calluses on her hands and grief in her eyes. Every man on the ranch figured she would last until noon at most. It was the spring of 1878, out in the broad red rock country of southern Colorado, where the San Juan Mountains shouldered the horizon and the sky went on forever in every direction. The grass had come back thick after a wet winter, and Lionel Stone's cattle were fat and restless across 3,000 acres of good grazing land. It was branding season, the kind of week that separated a real outfit from a pretend one, and Lionel had put out the word through Pueblo and as far east as Trinidad that he needed every able-bodied hand he could get. He had not expected a widow. Wilhelmina arrived in a buckboard she drove herself, her dark hair pinned tight under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. She was 31 years old, with strong, square shoulders and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, not quite green, not quite gray, but something alive in between. She wore her dead husband's work clothes, which were a size too large, and she had belted them tight with a length of braided leather. In the back of the buckboard were 2 saddlebags and a bedroll, and that was the entirety of her worldly situation. She pulled the team to a stop in front of the main corral where Lionel was sorting cattle with his foreman, a barrel-shaped man named Dewey Cobb who had been on the spread since before it was a real spread, and who treated every surprise as a personal insult. Dewey looked at her the way a man looks at rain on a day he had specifically planned to be dry. Lionel was slower to react. He was 36, lean through the middle and broad through the jaw, with sun-browned skin and a habit of measuring people quietly before he spoke. He had been ranching this land for 8 years, having come out of Missouri with nothing but a good horse, a small inheritance, and a stubborn belief that the land out here was worth fighting for. He had built Stone Creek from raw dirt, and every board and fence post on the property bore his particular mark of exactness. He was not a flashy man. He was a serious one. He pulled off his gloves and walked to the edge of the fence. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he said. "I am here about the work," Wilhelmina said. She did not say it as a question. Dewey made a sound somewhere between a cough and a laugh. Lionel silenced him with a look. "The branding work," Lionel said. "That is the work being advertised," she said. He studied her for a moment. There was no hesitation in her face. Whatever grief was living behind those creekwater eyes, it was not making her soft. He had seen softer expressions on courthouse judges. "You have experience," he said. "I ran cattle alongside my husband for 6 years on a spread outside of Walsenburg," she said. "I have branded, castrated, dehorned, and doctored more head of cattle than most of the men you will hire this week. My husband died of fever in January. The bank took the land in March. I need work and I am good at it. Those are the facts." There was a silence. A crow called from somewhere past the water trough. Dewey shifted his weight and looked at his boots. Lionel said, "What is your name?" "Wilhelmina Redmond." "Lionel Stone," he said. "The work pays $1.50 a day for skilled hands. We start at sunup and stop when the light goes. You will bunk in the tack room. It is clean and it has a door that latches." "That is agreeable," she said. "You can put your team in the East Corral. Cobb will show you where things are." Dewey looked at him like he had grown a second head. Lionel just turned back to the cattle sorting and said, without looking up, "Well, Cobb, show the lady where things are." That was how it began. The tack room was not a bad place to sleep. It smelled of leather and saddle oil and hay, and someone had long ago nailed a wooden shelf to one wall where Wilhelmina arranged her few things: a tin cup, a small book of scripture that had belonged to her mother, a folding knife, and a photograph in a cracked frame of a man with kind eyes and a beard. Her husband, Thomas Redmond, who had been 29 when the fever took him, leaving her with nothing but the work habits he had helped her build and the grief she was still in the middle of carrying. She set the photograph on the shelf and stood looking at it for a moment in the thin lantern light. She did not cry. She had done her crying through January and February. Now she was in the business of surviving, and she was good at that too. She was up before the sun. The ranch hands assembled at the big fire pit behind the main barn, where the branding irons were already heating in the coals. There were 7 of them besides Dewey Cobb Ruff, experienced men ranging from a young Mexican vaquero named Esteban, who could not have been more than 20 years old, to an old hand named Buford who claimed to have trailed cattle up from Texas before the war. When Wilhelmina walked up to the fire, every one of them stopped talking. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the grate, found herself a flat rock to sit on, and looked at the cattle in the holding pen with the calm professional assessment of someone planning a day's work. She did not explain herself. She did not apologize for being there. She just drank her coffee and watched the cattle. Lionel came out of the house just as the sky was turning from black to deep blue. He noticed her immediately. She was impossible not to notice, being the only woman present, and he noticed also that she had positioned herself near the irons, where the most experienced hands always stood to claim the hottest work. He said nothing about it. He just called the day's assignments. The first part of the morning went the way every branding morning went, loud, hot, and confused. The cattle were driven in lots of 10 from the holding pen into the working pen, where ropers caught them and flankers wrestled them down, and the branders pressed the hot iron to their sides, while a man with a knife did the other necessary work. The smell was hair and smoke and manure and blood, and the noise was constant. Dewey had assigned Wilhelmina to the fire tending the irons, rotating them, making sure they stayed at the right heat and were ready when called for. It was an important job, but a stationary one, and it was the job they gave to hands they were not sure about yet. She did it perfectly for the first hour. She read the irons the way a cook reads a pan, knowing by color and sound when they were ready and when they had gone too cold or too hot. She never let a brander wait more than a second for a fresh iron. She tracked 3 irons simultaneously without looking confused. Esteban, the young vaquero, was the first to say something. "You know fires well," he said, coming to swap out an iron. "My husband taught me," she said. "He said a bad iron ruins a brand and a ruined brand is a lawsuit waiting to happen." Esteban smiled. He was right. Around the middle of the morning, one of the hired hands, a thick-necked man named Arlo who had come up from Raton, took a bad fall when a calf threw itself sideways. He went down hard on his shoulder and came up cursing, and it was clear from the way he held his arm that he was done for the day. That left a gap in the flanking team, which was the heaviest work, the work of throwing cattle, and the work that a lot of men avoided. Dewey looked around at the available hands. Everyone was already assigned. Wilhelmina set down her iron tool, pulled her gloves tight, and walked into the working pen. "I can flank," she said. Dewey looked at her. "Those calves weigh 300 pounds. "I am aware of what a calf weighs," she said. The next calf came in on the rope, and before Dewey had finished deciding what to say about it, Wilhelmina had moved up alongside the animal, got her hand in the proper grip on its flank, and put the calf down clean. Not hard, not wild, just efficient. The animal was on its side in less than 3 seconds, and she had a knee on its neck before the brander was even across the pen. There was a brief silence. Then Buford, who had been trailing cattle since before half these men were born, nodded once and said, "All right then." After that, nobody questioned whether she belonged in the working pen. By late morning, Lionel had moved himself from the sorting chute to the working pen so he could see the operation more closely. He told himself it was because the flanking team was short a man, and he wanted to make sure things were running right. He did not examine this reason too closely. What he saw was a woman who worked with her whole body and her whole attention, every movement economical and precise. She anticipated the cattle before they moved. She repositioned herself between animals without being told, always where she was needed. When a brander fumbled his iron, she steadied the animal with one hand and took the iron from him with the other, pressed it clean against the hide, and handed it back without a word. By noon, Dewey came to stand beside Lionel at the fence. "Well," Dewey said. Lionel said nothing. "She is going to be better than Arlo was," Dewey said. "Arlo was sloppy. She is not sloppy." "No," Lionel agreed. "She is not." They ate the noon meal at long tables set up in the shade of the barn, biscuits and beans and salt beef, and more coffee. The men were tired and loud, talking over each other the way tired men do. Wilhelmina sat at the end of one table and ate without talking much, though Esteban sat beside her and she seemed comfortable with that. He was asking her questions about the cattle she had run at Walsenburg, and she answered them plainly and with detail. Lionel sat across the table and 2 seats down. He was not quite listening. Then he was. The trouble with high country cattle is the altitude affects their lungs if you move them too fast, she was saying to Esteban. Thomas, my husband, learned that from a man who had come up from New Mexico. You move a herd slow in altitude, especially in the first week, and you lose far fewer. Most ranchers do not know this. I did not know this, Esteban said, genuinely interested. Most do not, she said, without any pride in it. Lionel filed this information away without acknowledging that he had heard it. The afternoon was harder than the morning. The heat climbed toward 90 degrees and the cattle were more agitated, and the work of the flanking team became heavier and more constant. 2 more of the hired hands were carrying minor injuries by 2 o'clock, nothing serious but enough to slow them down. Wilhelmina did not slow down. She took a set of bruised ribs from a calf that kicked sideways, and she did not say a word about it. Esteban saw her wince and asked her quietly if she was all right. She said she had had worse. She kept working. It was around 3 o'clock that the day's most difficult animal came in, a big steer calf that had broken out of the holding pen twice already and that none of the ropers were feeling good about. He was wild-eyed and fast and heavy, and the first roper missed his loop entirely, which was embarrassing. Lionel had come into the working pen by then, taking up the slack left by the injured men. He and Wilhelmina were working the same side of the pen, and without discussing it, they had fallen into an easy rhythm, trading the heavy work back and forth without getting in each other's way. The big steer calf came in on a tight loop fighting the rope, and Wilhelmina moved for it at the same moment Lionel did. They nearly ran into each other. They both stopped, a foot apart with the animal thrashing between them. Wilhelmina looked at him. Lionel looked at her. I have the back legs, she said. I have the head, he said. They put the animal down together in a single coordinated movement, smooth as if they had been doing it for years, and they held him while the brand was applied and the work was done. And then they released him at the same moment and stepped back and looked at each other again with something that might have been surprise. Good, Lionel said. Good, she agreed. It was not much, but something had shifted. By the time the light started failing and Lionel called the end of the day's work, the count was in 112 head branded, which was the best single-day total the Stone Creek spread had put up in 3 years. Dewey announced this fact to the assembled hands with the particular satisfaction of a man who knows his crew has done well. There was a general noise of approval and tiredness. Men moved toward the water troughs and the wash basins and the cook's fire. Dewey came to Lionel and said, quietly, "She was the best hand on the spread today. I will say it out loud if you want me to." "She knows it already," Lionel said. "So do you," Dewey said, and went to wash his hands. Lionel stood at the edge of the working pen in the fading light, looking at the count tally in his hand without really seeing it. He was thinking about the way Wilhelmina Redmond moved through work, not like a woman proving something, but like a person who simply knew what they were doing and did it. There was no performance in it. There was just competence, and underneath the competence there was something else, something that lived in the steadiness of her hands and the quietness of her eyes, and he had no word for it yet, but he was aware of it the way you are aware of a fire in a room before you see the flame. He went to wash his hands and try not to think about it. He mostly failed. Dinner that night was a more serious affair than the noon meal. The cook, an old man named Hobson who had fed more cattle crews than he could count, had made a proper stew with dumplings and there was pie, and the men ate with the deep contentment of people who have worked hard and know it. There was talking and some harmless argument about who had done the best throw of the day, and Esteban made a case that was generally supported that the best throw had been the big steer calf at 3 o'clock. Could not have done it without the lady, Buford said, which was not something Buford said lightly. Wilhelmina, sitting at the end of the table, said, could not have done it without the man either. There was a brief moment where everyone seemed to understand that by the man she meant Lionel, and several of the ranch hands looked at Lionel, and Lionel looked at his pie. After dinner, while the men were talking around the fire and the night was coming in cool from the mountains, Wilhelmina walked down to the East Corral to check her team. She did this every evening, the same way she did everything thoroughly, without making a show of it. She checked their feet and their water and their hay, and she stood with her hand on the neck of the older horse, a gray gelding named Absalom who had been Thomas's horse before hers, and she let herself be quiet for a moment. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was Lionel carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, one of which he held out toward her. She took it. "Thank you," she said. He leaned against the corral fence and looked at the horses. "Good animals," he said. "The gray was my husband," she said. "He is 14 years old and still sound. Thomas used to say he would outlive us both." There was a pause. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky going from deep blue to black. "I am sorry about your husband," Lionel said. It was not a formal condolence. It was a quiet thing said like he meant it. Wilhelmina looked into her coffee cup. "He was a good man," she said. "He taught me most of what I know about cattle and horses and land. He thought I should know all of it, not just the parts that were traditionally a woman's work. Said a ranch runs better when both people on it understand the whole operation." She paused. "He was right about that too." "He sounds like a practical man," Lionel said. "He was," she said. "He was also kind. The two things together are rarer than you would think." They stood quietly for a while. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. The coffee was good and the night was full of the sound of crickets, and somewhere distant a coyote was saying something to the dark. "You will be back tomorrow?" Lionel asked. "You agreed to work for the week," she said. "I do not leave jobs unfinished." "No," he said. "I do not expect you do." She handed him back the empty cup. "Good night, Mr. Stone." "Good night, Mrs. Redmond." She walked back toward the tack room, and Lionel stood at the corral fence long after she had gone, looking at the dark shapes of the horses and thinking things he did not have names for yet. The next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, Wilhelmina was up before everyone else. She became part of the rhythm of the ranch the way water becomes part of stone over time, gradually, certainly, and permanently, though you might not notice it happening until it has already happened. She was not only good at branding work. She noticed things. On the second day she mentioned to Lionel without ceremony that one of the heifers in the south pen was showing signs of a respiratory infection that needed treating before it spread to the other animals. She had caught it by sound. There was a particular quality to the animal's breathing that she knew. Lionel had looked at the heifer himself and then sent for his medicine kit, and she had been right. They treated the animal together that afternoon, and 3 days later it was fine. On the third day she reorganized the sequence of the working pen without being asked, shifting the order in which lots were brought in so that the more agitated animals came in after the calmer ones had already been worked and removed. The change reduced the time each animal spent in the pen by nearly a third, which meant less stress on the cattle and less work for the flankers. Dewey noticed this after an hour and came to find Lionel. "Did you change the sequence?" he asked. "No," Lionel said. Dewey looked across the pen to where Wilhelmina was working. "She did," he said. "She did," Lionel agreed. "She is right," Dewey said, sounding somewhat aggrieved by this fact. On the fourth evening, the hired hands from town began to pack up and leave. Their commitment was 3 days. They had been paid, and they had other places to be. Arlo and his bad shoulder were already gone. By the end of the fourth evening, it was just the permanent crew: Dewey Cobb, Esteban, Buford, and 2 other steady hands named Garrett and Prentice who had been on the Stone Creek spread for 2 years and 3 years respectively. Wilhelmina's week was technically done as well. She had been paid her wages, $7.50 for 5 days, which was the honest accounting of the agreed $50 per day, and she had put the money in the small leather purse she kept in her saddlebag, and she had not said anything about leaving, but the logical implication of the arrangement was that she would go. On the morning of the 6th day, Lionel found her already at the South Corral checking on the heifer that had been sick. "She looks good," Wilhelmina said, without turning around. "Another 3 days of the sulfur treatment and she will be fully sound." Lionel came and stood beside her and looked at the heifer. "Mrs. Redmond," he said. "Yes." "Where are you going from here?" She was quiet for a moment. "I had thought perhaps toward Denver," she said. "There is more work in a city, laundry work perhaps, or cooking." The word laundry sitting in the same sentence with the woman who had been the best hand on this spread for 5 days was such a wrong thing that Lionel felt it physically. "I am short a hand," he said. "Arlo will not be back, and Buford has been talking about his sister in Kansas since February, which means I will lose him by summer." "Are you offering me permanent work?" she said. "I am offering you a job that pays $1.50 a day," he said. "Same as the branding work. With a proper room in the bunkhouse extension, it has a window and its own door, and it is not the tack room." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the heifer. She studied his profile for a moment, the strong jaw, the honest line of his mouth, the way he was very carefully not looking at her. "That is a fair offer," she said. "Then it is settled," he said, and went to start the morning. It was not until he was halfway to the barn that he let himself breathe properly. The weeks that followed were the particular kind of happiness that neither person names, because naming it feels dangerous. Wilhelmina became part of the Stone Creek operation the way Lionel had always imagined a perfect partner would operate, not following behind him, not out ahead of him, but alongside. She saw things he missed. He understood things she had not encountered before. When they disagreed about how to handle a situation with the cattle or the land or the machinery of the ranch, they argued plainly and without rancor, and usually arrived at something better than either of them had started with. The crew adjusted to her quickly. Esteban had already adopted her as a kind of older sister figure and followed her around with questions she answered patiently. Garrett and Prentice were professional men who respected competence and found it in her, and said no more about it. Even Dewey Cobb, who had been the most skeptical on that first morning, had shifted to a position of gruff acknowledgement that expressed itself in small practical ways, saving her the best coffee from the first pot, making sure her horse was watered when he watered the others, telling newcomers about her abilities before they had a chance to doubt them. As for Lionel, he was dealing with something more complicated. He had not thought about a woman in years. He had been so entirely consumed by the building and the running and the protecting of Stone Creek that there had been no room for it. He had been 19 when he left Missouri and 36 now, and the years between had been full of drought and cattle prices and fence disputes and the slow, patient work of making a thing from nothing. He had been lonely in the way that busy people are lonely, not sharply, not urgently, but as a kind of background condition, like dust on a windowsill that you stop noticing. Wilhelmina Redmond had noticed the dust. What he noticed about her was a catalog he was embarrassed to have in his head. He noticed the way she tucked a loose strand of hair back behind her ear when she was concentrating. He noticed that she laughed quietly with her eyes first, before her mouth caught up. He noticed that she always left a little coffee in her cup, never quite finishing it, as if the last sip was being saved for something. He noticed that she read by lantern light in the evenings, not scripture, though she had that too, but a thick book of natural history that she had apparently been carrying in her saddlebag, and that was worn at the spine from a long relationship with her hands. He noticed her hands. They were strong and square and competent, like the rest of her. He had shaken those hands exactly once, on the first day when they struck the work arrangement, and the memory of that handshake was more vivid than it should have been. He thought about all of this and found it inconvenient and kept it to himself. The trouble was, it did not stay quiet. It got louder. About 3 weeks into Wilhelmina's permanent employment at Stone Creek, Lionel rode out to the north pasture to check a section of fencing that Prentice had reported was showing wear. It was a long ride, the better part of an hour, and the morning was perfect in the way that late May mornings in southern Colorado are perfect, cool and clean with the smell of sage, and the mountains still carrying snow on their high shoulders and the sky so blue it looked manufactured. He was fixing the third fence post, which had rotted at the base and needed pulling and replacing, when he heard hoofbeats. Wilhelmina came around the edge of the cottonwood stand at an easy lope, riding the bay mare she had taken as her regular mount from Lionel's string. She had a coil of spare wire on her saddle and a post-hole digger balanced across her thighs. She had either seen him come out here or someone had told her about the fence situation, and she had simply come to help. She pulled up beside him and looked at the broken post. "Rotted," she said. "All the way through," he said. She swung down and tied her horse and took the post-hole digger and went to work without being asked. Lionel watched her for a second and then went back to pulling the old post. They worked together in the easy silence that had become the characteristic sound of their partnership, and the fence section was repaired in an hour and a half instead of the 3 it would have taken him alone. They ate their noon meal sitting on the grass in the shade of the cottonwoods, dried beef and hardtack and the apples that Hobson kept in the root cellar. The stream that gave the ranch its name ran nearby, chattering over its stones, and a pair of red-tailed hawks were doing something ceremonial high above them. "Can I ask you something?" Wilhelmina said. "Yes," he said. "Why have you never married?" He looked at the stream for a long moment. The question was plain, and she had asked it plainly, without coyness, the way she asked everything. "I have been building this," he said, with a gesture that encompassed the land. "There is never a moment when it feels finished enough to bring someone else into. It will never feel finished," she said. "A ranch is a living thing. It is never finished." "I know that now," he said. "I did not know it at 25. She looked at him sideways, reading something in his face. "Do you feel that way still, that it needs to be finished before it can hold more than just you?" He met her eyes. The creek water color of them, that alive shade between green and gray, was very clear in the noon light. "No," he said quietly. "I do not feel that way still." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and then she looked back at the stream, and the hawks were still there, turning lazy circles against the blue, and neither of them said anything else about it for a while. But something had been said. It was Esteban who first mentioned it out loud, as young men sometimes do when they have decided that the obvious needs stating. He said it to Dewey Cobb one evening by the bunkhouse, not knowing that Lionel was on the other side of the wall doing maintenance on a bridle and could hear every word. "He watches her," Esteban said, in a tone that was not gossiping but simply reporting a fact. "I know he does," Dewey said. "She watches him too. She thinks no one notices, but I notice." "You are 20 years old, Esteban. You notice things like that. Is that a criticism?" "No," Dewey said. "It is an observation. 20-year-olds should notice things like that. It is one of the few advantages of being 20. A pause in which Lionel set down the bridle and sat very still. "He should say something," Esteban said. "He will when he is ready," Dewey said. "The man moves slow on personal things. He always has, but he moves sure. She is going to think he is not interested." "She is not going to think that," Dewey said. "She is not a fool." Lionel picked the bridle back up and went back to his maintenance and thought about slow and sure, and whether those were virtues or just fear wearing a more respectable name. He decided that evening that fear wearing a respectable name was still fear, and fear was no way to live on a ranch or anywhere else. He did not say anything that evening. He was not ready, but he started trying to be. It came about naturally, the way the important things do, when you stop trying to force them and let the shape of your days do the work. It was a Sunday in early June, which was the one morning in 7 when the routine of the ranch loosened a little, and the men had time for whatever they needed to do with it, mending their own clothes, writing letters, sleeping late. Hobson made flapjacks on Sundays, which was a tradition on the Stone Creek spread, and the smell of them was different from the smell of every other morning. Wilhelmina had been to the small town of Vernal Creek, 12 miles to the southwest, on Saturday for supplies, and she had come back with the supplies and also a second-hand copy of a book of poetry that she had found at the dry goods store, placed there by someone who had decided it was not useful. She had been reading it Sunday morning on the step outside the tack room. She was still in the tack room because the bunkhouse extension room was being repaired after a ceiling board had come down in the spring rains, a situation that Lionel was dealing with at a pace that Dewey had privately described to Buford as suspiciously unhurried. Lionel brought her flapjacks on a tin plate and sat down on the step beside her without being invited, which was either a presumption or a statement of comfort, and she moved over to make room, which answered the question. "What is the book?" he asked. She showed him the cover. It was a collection of verse by a poet she had read in school before the ranch years when she had been a girl in Ohio who read everything she could find. "Do you like poetry?" he said. "I like language that works hard," she said. "Poetry has to do more with fewer words than any other kind of writing. I respect that economy." He ate his flapjacks and thought about this. "Read me one," he said. She looked at him, surprised not by the request but by the simplicity of it. She turned to a page she had marked and read one about a field in autumn, the way the light falls sideways through bare branches, the way the cold arriving is also a kind of clarity. It was 12 lines. She read them well without performance in the plain voice she used for plain things. When she finished, there was a silence. "That is good," he said. "It is," she agreed. They sat on the step in the Sunday morning sunshine, eating flapjacks and not saying much, and the ranch was quiet around them in the particular way it was quiet on Sundays, and the mountains were there at the edge of the world as they always were, patient and enormous. "Mrs. Redmond," he said. "You have been calling me Mrs. Redmond for 6 weeks," she said. "You could call me Wilhelmina." "Wilhelmina," he said, and the word in his voice was something she felt in the middle of her chest. "I want to say something to you." She put the book down. She looked at her flapjacks. "All right," she said. "I'm not good at this," he said, "at saying personal things. I was raised by people who did not say them much, and I have lived alone for a long time, and I do not have much practice." "I have noticed," she said quietly, not critically, just honestly. "I am aware that you came here to work and that you have been working and that I am your employer and that it would be wrong to—" He stopped, started again. "What I want to say is that I have thought about you more than I have thought about anything else in a considerable time, and I would like, with your permission, to think about that in a different way than the way an employer thinks about an employee. I would like to think about it in a—" He stopped again. Wilhelmina said gently, "Lionel." He looked at her. "I know what you are trying to say," she said. "I have been waiting 6 weeks for you to say it." Something in his face changed. "You have." "Esteban told me you watch me," she said. "He was being kind. What he was actually telling me was that you were working up to something and that I should not lose patience." Lionel laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him. "Esteban is 20 years old. He is very perceptive," she said, "and he was right." "Is the waiting, has it been frustrating?" he asked. She considered this with the same honesty she brought to everything. "A little," she said, "but I understood it. You are a careful man, you do not do things halfway." She paused. "I would not want you to be otherwise." He looked at her on the step in the morning light, this woman with her strong shoulders and her Creekwater eyes and her dead husband's horses and her book of poetry and her particular way of being exactly who she was without apology or performance, and he thought that whatever the word was for what he felt, it was not a small word. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that is agreeable." She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile fully, not the quiet I-first version but the whole thing, and it was considerable. "That is agreeable," she said. He held out his hand. She took it. They sat on the step with their hands joined between them looking at the mountains. That was the beginning of a different kind of thing. Courting on a working ranch in 1878 was not like courting in a parlor or a town drawing room. It happened in the margins of work. in the small intervals between one task and the next, in the evenings when the day's labor was done, and the fire was going and the stars were coming out. It happened in conversations that started about cattle and ended somewhere else entirely. It happened in the way two people ride side by side for hours saying nothing and saying everything. Lionel was serious about the proper part of it. He was aware that Wilhelmina had been married, that she had loved someone else, that the photograph on the shelf in the tack room represented a real and present grief, not a closed chapter but a continuing one. He did not rush her. He did not ask her to put Thomas Redmond away or minimize what that loss had been. He simply showed up every day and let her see that he was there. She found this extraordinarily moving. She had expected, if anything happened between them at all, that a man of his age and solitude would be impatient, would want things to move at his pace. She had even prepared herself to explain that she needed time, that there was grief still to carry, that she was not available to simply step from one life into another. She had prepared this explanation and kept it ready. She never needed to use it. What Lionel gave her instead was space to grieve and company to grieve in, which were two different things that most people gave one or the other of. He did not comfort her when she was sad because she had not asked to be comforted. He just stayed nearby, and that turned out to be what she needed most. On a warm Thursday evening 3 weeks after the Sunday on the step, they rode out to the north end of the property together, to a rise above the creek where you could see for 20 miles in any direction, the flat land to the east and the mountains rising to the west, and the sky doing something orange and gold as the sun went down. They had ridden out on the practical pretext of checking the water hole at the north fence line, which was a perfectly legitimate thing to do and also a pretext. "Tell me about him," Lionel said when they were sitting at the top of the rise with the horses ground-tied below. "Thomas," she said. "If you want to," she thought for a moment. "He was funny," she said. That is the thing people do not know about him because he was also quiet and serious-looking. But he had a very dry humor, the kind that arrives unexpectedly. "He made me laugh every day." She paused. "He was not as good with cattle as he thought he was. He was good, but he overestimated himself, which is a very common male affliction. I did not tell him that while he was alive." Lionel smiled. "A charitable decision." "He would have been cross about it for 3 days and then admitted I was right," she said. "He was also good at admitting when he was wrong, which is rarer than the humor." "Do you miss him every day?" Lionel asked. "Yes," she said simply. "Not the way I did in January. The shape of it has changed. It is less sharp and more present, like a room in a house that is always there, that you do not always enter but that you know is there." He nodded. He understood this in the way that people understand things they have not experienced themselves but that make complete sense when described well. "I am glad you had someone like that," he said. She looked at him. "You do not find it strange to be interested in a woman who still carries her husband?" "No," he said. "I would find it strange if you did not. A person who loves well once is more likely to love well again, not less. The grief is evidence of the love, and the love is evidence of the person." He paused, and he was quiet for a moment, looking at the orange sky. "I would rather be with someone who knows how to love like that than someone who never had to." Wilhelmina was very still. Then she reached across the space between them and put her hand over his, which was resting on his knee. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat on the rise above the creek and watched the last of the light go out of the sky, and the stars came up one by one as they always did, patient and enormous, just like the mountains. It was July when Buford finally left for Kansas and his sister, as he had been threatening to do since February. He went with handshakes all around, and Hobson's dried apple cake wrapped in cloth for the journey, and the ranch was 4 hands plus Wilhelmina. It was also July when a man named Carlyle came to Stone Creek. Carlyle was from a land company out of Denver that had been buying up ranch properties in the county, and he came in a good suit with a letter of offer and a pleasant professional manner that did not quite cover an underlying assumption that things were going to go his way. He wanted to buy the Stone Creek spread, or at least the north section, the best grazing land, which was the part that Lionel had worked hardest to develop. Lionel received him in the main house, which was a modest structure with a front room that served as office and sitting room combined, and he listened to the offer with full attention and a face that revealed nothing. The offer was not bad. Carlyle was offering fair market value for the north section, perhaps a little above it. He had done his homework, but the north section was the heart of the ranch. Without it, Stone Creek was a reduced thing, a surviving thing instead of a thriving one. Lionel had built that north pasture with 8 years of fence work and water development and careful grazing rotation, and the idea of selling it to a Denver land company that would break it into parcels and sell them off again was something he felt in the same place he felt everything that mattered to him. He told Carlyle he would think about it. After Carlyle left in his hired buggy, Lionel stood on the front porch for a long time. He was aware that his finances were not as strong as they should be. The winter had been expensive: feed costs, veterinary work on 3 animals, the cost of the bunkhouse repairs. The bank note on the South Water development was due in 6 months. The offer from the land company would cover the note and leave something over. He did not tell any of this to Wilhelmina. He was not sure why not, except that it felt like a burden that was his to carry. She knew anyway because she was that kind of person. What did the man from Denver want? She asked that evening, coming to lean on the fence rail beside him. He told her. All of it, including the financial situation, which came out almost against his will, the way the truth comes out when you are talking to someone you trust completely. She was quiet for a while after he finished. Then she said, "What is the value of the North Water development?" "The well and the tank system you built up there," he told her. She did calculations in her head that he could see her running. "And if you renegotiated the note terms with the bank, pushed the payment by 4 months, that would take you into the fall cattle sale, and the prices will be better in the fall." "I have not asked the bank," he said. "Would Whitmore give you the extension?" she said. Whitmore was the banker in Vernal Creek. "Possibly," Lionel said. "He has known me 8 years. "Then the first step is that conversation," she said. "The second step is a close look at the grazing rotation on the south section. If we move the herd earlier to the east pasture, we can rest the south section for an extra 4 weeks, and it will support more head in the fall at better weights. That is more money at market." She was doing this not as an employee offering suggestions. She was doing it as a partner working a problem. He could feel the difference. "You do not have to," he started. "Lionel," she said, and her voice was gentle but also certain. "This ranch matters to me. What happens here matters to me." She paused. "You matter to me." He looked at her. The evening light was in her hair and on her face, and she was looking at him directly, the way she always did, without ornament or hesitation. "I know," he said. "You matter to me too." He was quiet for a moment. "More than I know how to say most of the time." "I know that too," she said. He talked to Whitmore. The banker, who had indeed known Lionel Stone for 8 years and respected what he had built, gave him the 4-month extension on the note. The south section was rested, and the herd was rotated, as Wilhelmina had suggested. And by September the cattle were heavier, and the grazing was good, and the fall sale was looking promising. The letter from the Denver Land Company went unanswered and eventually stopped coming. Stone Creek was going to be all right. It was on a clear September evening, with the aspens turning gold on the mountain slopes above the ranch, and the air smelling of autumn, and the smell of Hobson's cooking coming from the direction of the kitchen, that Lionel took Wilhelmina to the rise above the creek again. They had made it something of a ritual riding up there in the evenings when the light was good, watching the sky change. It was their place, in the way that certain places become certain people's places without formal designation. He had something in his coat pocket. He had been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment, and then overthinking whether there was a right moment, and then deciding that the only right moment was the one he made. When they were sitting at the top of the rise in the last of the golden light, he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring. It was not new. It had belonged to his mother, a small garnet in a plain silver setting, worn smooth with age. He had brought it from Missouri with everything else and kept it in a box for 17 years. Wilhelmina looked at it in his open palm. "Wilhelmina Redmond," he said, and his voice was steady because he had decided it would be. "I am not a man who does things without thinking about them. I have thought about this for every day of the past 6 months. You came to this ranch to work, and you have worked as well as anyone I have ever known, and you have changed this place and you have changed me, and I do not want to spend the rest of my life running Stone Creek without you at my side, not as a hired hand, not as a partner in only the business sense, but as my wife." He paused. "I love you. I am not very practiced at saying that, but it is true. I have loved you since somewhere around the afternoon of the branding when you put that big steer calf down and looked at me like we were sharing a joke that nobody else was in on." He paused again. "I will be a faithful and honest husband. I will never ask you to be less than you are. I will not pretend I know everything or that Stone Creek runs better without your ideas in it, because it does not." He stopped. He had run out of words. Wilhelmina was looking at the ring. Then she was looking at him. Her creekwater eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you for longer than I said anything about because I was afraid to, because Thomas was—" She stopped, started again. "I was afraid it meant I was forgetting him, loving you." "Does it?" he said. "No," she said. "It does not. I understand that now." She looked at the ring again. "He would have liked you. He was practical and honest, and he had a good sense of humor. He would have looked at you and said, 'That man knows how to fix a fence,' which was his highest form of praise." She laughed, and the laugh was full of grief and happiness both, which is the way grief and happiness exist together when they are both real. "Yes," she said. "Lionel Stone, yes." He put the ring on her finger. His hands were not entirely steady. She noticed and covered them with her own. They sat on the rise above the creek in the September gold with their hands together, and the mountains going purple in the distance, and the first stars beginning to appear, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to human happiness, which made the human happiness feel all the more remarkable for existing at all. They married in October, when the aspens were fully gold, and the mountains had their first serious snow, and the air smelled like something ending and beginning at the same time. It was a plain ceremony, performed by the circuit preacher who came through Vernal Creek twice a year, held in the small church in town with the crew of Stone Creek in their good clothes, and a scattering of neighbors from the ranches within 20 miles, and Whitmore the banker and his wife, and a woman named Clara from the dry goods store, who had been Wilhelmina's one local friend since her first supply run. Esteban wore a jacket that was slightly too short in the sleeves and looked extremely pleased with himself, as though he were personally responsible for the occasion, which in a sense he was. Dewey Cobb wore his best hat and said nothing at all during the ceremony except, "About time," which he said quietly enough that only Prentice heard it, and Prentice agreed. Wilhelmina wore a dress that Clara had helped her make from blue wool, the color somewhere between the mountains and the sky, and she wore her hair down for the first time in anyone on the ranch's experience of her, and it was dark and long, and Lionel, seeing her come down the aisle of the little church, felt something in his chest that he had no word for, which was becoming his standard experience in her presence. He said his vows in the plain, steady voice he had decided on. She said hers in the plain, honest voice that was simply her own. The preacher said the words, and they said the words, and the rings were exchanged, and it was done. The celebration afterward was at the ranch, around the big fire pit, and Hobson had made more food than was strictly necessary, and there was music from a fiddle that Garrett turned out to own and play competently, and the night was cold and bright, and the fire was warm, and the mountains were dark against the stars. At some point in the middle of the evening, Lionel found Dewey standing apart from the dancing, looking into his cup. "Thank you," Lionel said. Dewey looked up. "For what?" "For telling me to give her a job," Lionel said. "That morning, when you could have told me not to." Dewey made a sound that was approximately a laugh. I told you to show her the corral. That is a long way from a wedding. Not as long as it looks, Lionel said. Dewey looked at Wilhelmina, who was dancing with Esteban in the circle of firelight, laughing at something he had said, her blue dress moving and her dark hair loose and her face entirely alive. Then he looked back at Lionel. No, Dewey said. I suppose it is not. They moved the photograph of Thomas Redmond to the mantelpiece in the main house, where the light was better. Wilhelmina placed it there herself, on a Sunday morning, and stood before it for a moment in the quiet way she did some things. Lionel stood behind her, not interfering, just present. I am not replacing anything, she said, partly to the photograph and partly to herself. I am adding. Then she turned, and the house was full of morning light, and the smell of coffee, and Lionel was standing there with 2 cups, and that was the shape of their life beginning. The first winter of their marriage was the proving of it. A working ranch in winter is a test of everything a partnership is made of. The cold comes in early in southern Colorado, real cold, the kind that kills cattle if you are not ahead of it, and there is no end to what needs doing. Feed must be hauled, water must be broken open, sick animals must be brought in, fences must be walked in snow. They did all of it together, which was neither romantic nor unromantic but simply real. There were mornings when the temperature was below 0, and the wind was coming off the mountains, and neither of them had slept enough, and the work was just work, without any beauty in it. There were evenings when they were too tired for much of anything, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee while the fire kept the cold back, not talking much, just existing in the same space. It was in those plain moments that Wilhelmina found the thing she had not known she was looking for. Not the grand feelings, she had had those, she knew what those were, but the quiet. The particular quietness of sitting across a table from a person and knowing that the quiet is safe, that you can put everything down in it and it will hold. She mentioned this to him one evening, trying to find words for it. He listened. Then he said, "That is what I have wanted my whole life. A quiet that holds." They looked at each other across the table. "We have it," she said. "We do," he said. By spring of 1879, Wilhelmina had learned that she was expecting their first child. She knew before she told him, carrying the knowledge for a few days in the way you carry something precious and fragile before you are sure of its weight. She had been happy before in her life. She was not new to happiness, but this particular thing, the knowledge that the life they had made together was making more life, was a specific happiness she had not expected to find again. She told him in the evening after supper at the kitchen table where they always sat. He was very still for a moment. Then his face did something that it rarely did. It opened completely without any of the careful quiet he usually kept. He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them and was speechless, which was unusual for a man who was already not very talkative. "Are you well?" he finally said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling perfectly well," she said. "I am healthy and strong, and we have a good doctor in Vernal Creek. Everything will be fine." "You are certain?" "Lionel," she said. "I will be fine." He kissed her hands, both of them, which was not the kind of gesture he made often and therefore meant more for its rarity. "I am happy," he said, which was the simplest and most complete thing he could say. "So am I," she said. Esteban, when he was told the news the following week, immediately appointed himself unofficial godfather, a title no one had offered him but that everyone found appropriate. The summer of 1879 was a good one for Stone Creek. The cattle were healthy and the grass was strong and the water held through the dry months, and the ranch's finances had recovered fully from the previous year's strain. Lionel had made 2 improvements to the main barn and started work on a proper addition to the house, a second bedroom and a sitting room that Wilhelmina had drawn plans for on a piece of butcher paper at the kitchen table. He built it as she had drawn it. He did not deviate from her plans except to add a small window she had not put in, facing east, so that the room would have morning light. When she saw the window, she stood looking at it with her hand against the glass. "I did not draw that," she said. "No," he said. She looked at him. "It is exactly right," she said. "I know," he said. She kissed him, and the morning light was coming through the new window, and the addition smelled of fresh lumber and possibility. In September of 1879, she gave birth to a son. It was a hard labor, 17 hours, with the doctor from Vernal Creek present and Dewey Cobb pacing outside the house with the focused anxiety of a man who has never been so useless and knows it. Esteban had ridden to town for the doctor himself, at a gallop in the middle of the night, and had ridden back with him at a pace that the doctor described afterward as extremely motivated. Lionel did not pace. He stayed. He was in the room because Wilhelmina had said she wanted him there, and that was enough reason. He held her hand through the parts that required hand-holding, and he stayed out of the doctor's way through the parts that required that. And when the child finally arrived in the early hours of a cool September morning, he was there to see it. He had built things his whole life. He knew what it was to take something from nothing and make it real. This was like that, except entirely unlike anything he had ever experienced, and he had no language for it at all. The baby was a boy. 7 pounds and strong, with dark hair and the serious expression of someone encountering the world for the first time and deciding what to make of it. Wilhelmina, exhausted and entirely herself, held him against her chest and looked at Lionel with eyes that were full of everything. "What do you think?" she said. "I think," Lionel said, and his voice was not quite steady, "that this is the best thing I have ever seen." They named him James Thomas Stone. The Thomas was for Thomas Redmond, which was Wilhelmina's choosing, and Lionel did not hesitate about it for a moment. He said it was right. She said she loved him for saying it. The photograph on the mantelpiece was not moved. James Thomas Stone would grow up knowing it was there, and his mother would tell him who it was, and that story would become part of the larger story of who he was, and there was nothing wrong in any of it. Dewey Cobb, when he was finally allowed in, looked at the baby with the expression of a man who has absolutely no experience of babies and is making very conservative decisions about how to react. Then he said, "Healthy looking," which was the most sincere compliment he knew how to give. Esteban said, "He looks like you, Mrs. Stone," and then corrected himself, "Mrs. Wilhelmina," and she laughed and said he was welcome to call her by her first name after everything he had done for them. Hobson made a cake. He made cakes for every significant occasion, and this was the most significant occasion the Stone Creek spread had seen. Life settled into a new shape after that, the way life does when a child arrives. All the rhythms shift, the days reorganize themselves around new needs, and the things that seemed important before reveal themselves as either truly important or not particularly. James was a good baby, which everyone agreed and which Wilhelmina said was luck rather than credit to herself, and then went about the business of being an excellent mother with the same efficiency and care she brought to everything. She did not stop working the ranch. She adapted. The baby went with her when it was possible and stayed with Hobson, who turned out to have an unexpected talent for keeping small children entertained, when it was not. Lionel was the kind of father who could not quite believe the situation he was in. He had come to Stone Creek alone and built it alone, and now there was this, a wife who made the ranch better and a son who made the whole enterprise feel like it had a direction that extended past his own lifetime. He handled the baby with great care and increasing confidence, and within a few months he could be found, on quiet evenings, sitting in the chair by the fire with James on his knee, talking to him in a low voice about the ranch, the cattle and the water and the fences and the plans, as though the baby were a business partner being briefed, which made Wilhelmina laugh every time she saw it. "He cannot understand you," she said one evening. "He is listening," Lionel said with perfect certainty. James did seem to be listening. He had the attentive eyes of someone taking things in, which might have been simple infant alertness, or might have been something specific to who he was going to be. Either way, the conversations between father and son over the fire became a fixture of the Stone Creek evenings. The second pregnancy announced itself in the spring of 1881, which Wilhelmina received with the calm of a woman who has done this before and knows what to expect. She told Lionel on a Sunday morning, at the kitchen table, as she had told him about James. He was prepared this time to take the news with more composure. He managed approximately 4 seconds of composure before his face did the opening thing again, and he took her hands across the table again, and she pointed this out to him with great affection. "You said you were going to be calmer about this one," she said. "I was mistaken about my capacity for calm," he said. The second child was a daughter born in October of 1881, named Clara Elizabeth Stone, Clara for Wilhelmina's friend from the dry goods store in Vernal Creek, who had cried when she heard the name, and Elizabeth for Lionel's mother, who had given him the garnet ring. She came into the world with a temperament of absolutely decided opinions, which the family recognized within the first week as a trait that was going to define her. James, who was just over 2 years old, regarded his sister with the complicated mixture of interest and territorial suspicion that older siblings have displayed since the beginning of human time, and then decided within approximately 2 weeks that she was acceptable, and stationed himself near her with a proprietary air. Stone Creek in the early 1880s was a different place from the raw operation that Lionel had been running when Wilhelmina arrived. The herd was larger and better bred. Wilhelmina had pushed for the introduction of better stock, and she had been right about the returns. The grazing rotation she had designed in that first year was now so deeply ingrained in the operation that the hands ran it automatically. The North Water System had been expanded twice. The main house had its addition, and a kitchen garden that Wilhelmina had put in because she had grown up with kitchen gardens in Ohio, and saw no reason why the frontier should deprive anyone of fresh vegetables. The crew had changed too. Esteban was now 24 and had become the most skilled hand on the spread, and Lionel had made him something between a foreman and a deputy foreman, a role that did not have a formal title, but that everyone understood. Dewey Cobb was 53 and talking, finally and with some conviction, about retiring. He had a sister in Colorado Springs and a standing invitation to come live with her that he had been deferring for 5 years. Garrett and Prentice were still there, solid and reliable, and there were 2 newer hands who had come on in the years since, a young man named Sullivan from New Mexico and an older hand named Ramos who had come up from Texas with impeccable credentials and a horse that was better than anyone else's horse on the property, a situation he seemed to find satisfying. The ranch was good. The family was good. The life they had made at Stone Creek was a real one, built from work and honesty, and 2 people who had decided to face the same direction. There were hard things in those years, as there are always hard things. A dry summer in 1882 that cost them cattle and worried them badly, which they got through by careful management and the reserves they had built up in better years. A dispute with a neighboring rancher over a water rights question that required a trip to the courthouse in Pueblo and 6 months of anxious waiting, and which was ultimately resolved in Stone Creek's favor by a judge who had clearly read the documentation carefully. A winter illness that took James down hard at 3 years old, those terrible days when the fever would not break and Wilhelmina and Lionel sat by his bed in shifts through several terrible nights, until the fever broke and the doctor said he was going to be fine, and Lionel went outside and stood in the yard in the cold for a long time saying nothing at all, just breathing. There were also beautiful things, small and large. The evening when Clara took her first steps and went directly toward a very surprised Esteban, who caught her with an expression of pure delight. The afternoon Wilhelmina found a pair of fox kits denning under the east barn and brought James to see them, and the look on his small face at the sight of them was something Lionel knew he would carry the rest of his life. The morning when a group of Ute people passed through the north section of the property, which was near traditional travel routes, and Lionel had met them with the respect of a man who understood they had been in this country far longer than he had, and they had exchanged information about weather and the condition of the mountain passes, and Wilhelmina had provided food for the journey, and both parties had parted with mutual courtesy. It was not a perfect world, and there were injustices all around them that the territory offered up without apology. The pressures on the Ute and Jicarilla Apache peoples, the particular difficulties faced by Mexican families like Esteban's who had been in this region for generations, the brutal economies that made men like Arlo and Buford and Sullivan work for $50 days in all weather with no security against injury. Wilhelmina talked about these things plainly because she always talked about things plainly, and Lionel listened and thought about what was in his power to effect on the scale of his own operation: fair wages, fair treatment, the simple decency of seeing the people who worked alongside him as people and not instruments. It was not enough. It never was entirely enough. But it was what they had, and they kept trying to make it more. By the spring of 1884, Stone Creek was 6 years into its second life. The life that had begun the morning a widow in borrowed clothes drove a buckboard up to the main corral and said she was there about the work. The ranch was as strong as it had ever been. The children were healthy and growing into the kind of distinct personalities that make their parents look at each other across the dinner table with expressions of astonishment. And the life that Lionel and Wilhelmina had made was so fully and completely theirs that it was hard to imagine any version of either of them that had not been heading toward it. Dewey Cobb retired in March of that year. He had been saying he would for 5 years, and one morning he finally said it in a way that meant it, and there was a send-off around the fire pit that was somewhat different in character from the wedding celebration of 1878, but equally felt. Dewey shook hands with all the men, clasped Esteban on the shoulder in a way that conveyed things he did not say, and then came to Lionel and Wilhelmina and stood before them for a moment. "You built something good here," he said to Lionel. "We built it," Lionel said. Dewey looked at Wilhelmina. "I did not want to hire you," he said. "On the first morning, I want you to know I am aware I was wrong about that." "I know you were aware," she said. "I could tell by the coffee." He almost smiled. For Dewey Cobb, it was a full and genuine smile. He said, "Take care of him. He is stubborn about rest." "I know," she said. "I have methods." He got into the wagon that Prentice was driving him to the stage line, and he did not look back, which was his style. And Wilhelmina and Lionel stood in the yard watching the wagon go and felt the particular bittersweetness of a good goodbye. "He loved this place," Lionel said. "He did," she agreed. "People do when it is built with love." He looked at her. She was looking down the road at the departing wagon, and the spring light was on her face, and she was 37 years old now, and the years had not diminished her at all, they had added to her, the way years add to people who live with intention and who do not run from what is hard. He took her hand. She took his. They stood in the yard of Stone Creek in the spring sun with their hands together, and the sound of the children inside the house, James's running feet and Clara's voice, which was already opinionated and clear coming through the open window, and the mountains at the edge of the world doing what they always did, patient and enormous and entirely themselves. There was a third child on the way. Wilhelmina had told him 2 weeks ago on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table, and he had done the hand-taking thing again, and she had pointed this out to him again, and he had said the same thing about his capacity for calm, and they had both laughed. It had become their ritual. The kitchen table and the coffee and the news and the hands and the laughter. It was a small and specific and completely real happiness, the kind that does not announce itself or require an audience, that simply exists in the actual substance of a shared life. In October of 1884, another son was born. They named him Daniel Lionel Stone, and he arrived with the practical efficiency of a third child who has worked out that the household is busy and is prepared to accommodate himself to its rhythms. James, who was 5, received this information about his brother with the calm of someone who had already done this once before and had a developed position on siblings. Clara, who was nearly 3 and who had opinions on everything, inspected the baby with the focused attention of a scientist, and declared him acceptable, which was high praise from Clara. Daniel did indeed prove to be accommodating and equable, which Esteban said was because he had learned early to make space for himself, and Hobson said was because he was simply a good-natured child, and Lionel said was a mystery and a gift. Wilhelmina said all three of them were right, and also that the baby needed feeding, and would everyone please stop standing over him. It was on a December evening of that year, with the snow coming down heavy outside and the fire in the main room going strong and the children asleep, and the house quiet in the particular way it was quiet after children slept, that Wilhelmina and Lionel sat together in the chairs by the fire as they often did. She had her book. He had the ranch accounts, which he was reviewing with the same thorough attention he brought to all numbers. The fire talked. The snow was quiet outside. He set the accounts down. "Do you ever think about that first day?" he said. She looked up from her book. "The branding, yes." She smiled the full smile, the one that started in her eyes. "I think about it often," she said. "I think about driving up in that buckboard and seeing you and Dewey at the fence and thinking, that man is going to tell me there is no work here for a woman." "I almost did," he said. "I know, I could see you deciding." "What made you think I would go the other way?" he said. She thought for a moment. "You looked at my hands," she said. "Before you looked at anything else. You looked at my hands and you saw the calluses and you made a different calculation. A man who sees the work first is a different kind of man." He was quiet for a while. "You were the best hand on the spread by afternoon." "I had good teachers," she said. "Thomas first and then the work itself. And now," he said, she set her book down. She looked at him across the fire. This man she had met as a stranger on the worst year of her life, who had given her work and then a home and then himself, who looked at her hands first and who built things carefully, and who held a baby like something infinitely precious, and who kept his word in every particular, and who had 3 times at the kitchen table taken her hands across the table and been unable to maintain composure, which she found more endearing than any amount of practiced poise. "And now," she said, "I have what I did not know I was looking for. I came here to survive. I stayed here because it became worth more than survival." He reached across from his chair and took her hand, which was the Stone Creek version of saying everything. Outside, the snow was coming down on the mountains, and the ranch and the land that Thomas Redmond had helped her love and that Lionel Stone had helped her love again, in a different way and with a different heart but a whole one, healed in the way things heal, not by disappearing, but by becoming part of the structure. The fire burned down slowly. The house held the snow out. The children slept in the rooms their father had built to exactly the right plans. Wilhelmina Redmond Stone, best hand on the spread, best thing that ever came to Stone Creek, woman who had lost everything and built everything again, looked at her husband in the firelight and felt the full and specific weight of a life that was hers and was good and was only going to grow. "Read to me," Lionel said. She picked up her book. She found a poem and read it in her plain and honest voice, and the fire and the snow and the sleeping children and the mountains outside were all exactly as they should be, and the life they had made was real and whole and fully resolved into the thing it was always becoming, and there was nothing left unbuilt. Stone Creek endured. The children grew, the work went on. And every spring, when the branding season came around and the irons went into the coals and the cattle were driven in, and the crew assembled at the fire pit for coffee in the gray morning light, Lionel Stone would look across the working pen at his wife moving through the work with her whole attention and her whole self, and he would think what he had thought on that first afternoon 6 years ago. Good, she is good, and he would feel the same thing he had felt every day since, which was that the best thing he had ever done was see her hands before he saw anything else, and give her the work, and let the rest become what it was always going to be. Which was everything, all of it, real and earned and lasting, built from the ground up in the red rock country of southern Colorado, in the good years and the hard ones alike, by 2 people who had learned that love, like a ranch, is never finished. It is only ever being built, day by day, honestly, by hands that know the work.